They said no maid had ever lasted inside the Langford estate. Not one. The wrought iron gates of 790 Strathmore Lane loomed like the entrance to a palace or a fortress. They were so tall they blocked the morning sun, casting long shadows onto the stone-paved driveway that shimmered as if polished by diamonds. Naomi Brooks stood before them, her worn sneakers unmoving her hands, clutching the frayed strap of a canvas bag. Beyond the gates, the sprawling white mansion sat in stoic silence. The house was immaculate, symmetrical, and impossibly still, like something airbrushed into a magazine ad. Towering palm trees lined the path to the front steps, their leaves swaying just enough to whisper, "You don't belong here." Naomi took a deep breath. The photograph tucked into her wallet weighed more than paper ever should. It was a picture of Amara, her daughter, lying pale and still beneath a tangle of hospital wires at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Just 8 years old and already fighting for her life. 3 months. Naomi had promised herself she could make it 3 months here. The pay was high, obscenely high. Enough to put a dent in the heart surgery bills. Enough to maybe give Amara a chance. She pressed the button on the intercom. The gates creaked open with mechanical precision, revealing a middle-aged woman in a crisp charcoal uniform. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun. She eyed Naomi up and down with a look so sharp it might have drawn blood. "Follow me," the woman said, turning without a greeting. Naomi stepped inside. The front courtyard was just as pristine as the house, with hedges cut into impossible symmetry and flower beds that looked like they'd never seen a single dead petal. As they passed a sleek black Lincoln parked to the side, a tall man in a dark suit stood by, arms crossed. He watched Naomi, his expression unreadable. That must be the driver, she thought. Dennis, maybe. She remembered the name from the job packet. A window above the courtyard creaked open. Another figure, an older woman in a white apron, glanced down, her arms crossed. She had a weathered face and narrow eyes, not curious, just cold. They're all watching. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and old money. The marble floors gleamed beneath Naomi's sneakers. The woman, Eleanor, the head housekeeper, stopped abruptly. "Clean the floor," she said. Then she disappeared. Naomi blinked. No instructions, no supplies, no welcome. She found a cleaning cloth folded neatly on a side table. That was the hint. This wasn't about dirt. It was about message. She knelt and began to wipe, slowly, carefully, leaving no streak behind. Her palms pressed into the cold marble, and the chill traveled straight to her bones. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep within the halls. Then click, click, click. The unmistakable sound of high heels descending the staircase. Naomi looked up. A woman stood at the top of the stairs in a floor-length wine-colored dress that clung to her like it had been poured onto her skin. Her golden blonde hair was twisted into a flawless updo, and in her hand was a delicate porcelain teacup. Vivian Langford. Naomi recognized her instantly. Photographed on red carpets, quoted in lifestyle magazines. The second, much younger wife of Charles Langford, the real estate billionaire who owned half of Los Angeles. Vivian's icy blue eyes scanned the foyer and landed on Naomi. Her gaze moved over her skin, her clothing, her posture. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. She descended the steps like royalty. "This is the new maid," she said aloud, though Naomi was the only person in sight. Naomi rose slightly from her knees. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Naomi." Vivian didn't respond. She stepped closer, looking down at the small patch of clean floor. Then, without warning, she tipped her teacup and let the brown liquid spill across the white marble. The tea splattered near Naomi's knees. Vivian arched an eyebrow. "This floor was cleaner before you arrived." Her voice was smooth as velvet, but colder than steel. "I'll never understand why they keep sending me people like you." Naomi's breath caught, but she forced herself still. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the driver, Dennis, watching from the archway, and Rose, the head cook, stood near the dining entrance, arms crossed, silently observing. This was a performance. "Clean it," Vivian said. Her tone was dismissive, but her eyes gleamed, waiting. Naomi knelt again, this time slower. She pressed the cloth into the puddle, blotting it with a steady hand. Her face burned, but she didn't flinch. In her mind, she saw Amara's tiny chest rising and falling in that hospital bed. "I will not lose this job," she told herself silently. Vivian turned the hem of her gown, brushing the floor like a wave. She disappeared into the hall, her perfume lingering like a threat. The audience dispersed. No one said a word. Naomi remained on the floor until every trace of the tea was gone. Then she folded the cloth neatly and placed it back on the table. Upstairs, the clock struck 10. She straightened her back, walked slowly toward the corridor Eleanor had disappeared into, and whispered under her breath, 3 months. I just need to last 3 months. Naomi followed the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble. She tried not to focus on the lingering burn of humiliation clinging to her skin. It was only day 1, and already the house had marked her, stained her pride like the tea on the floor. The hallway branched into several directions, but instinct guided her toward the back of the house. Soon she reached the kitchen, where the air smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon. It was large, spotless, and oddly clinical, more like a commercial space than a family kitchen. Rose Wilson, the cook, stood at the counter chopping vegetables with methodical precision. Her hands moved like clockwork, but her eyes flicked toward Naomi without stopping. "She really did it, huh?" Rose said, not looking up. Naomi didn't answer. Rose sighed and pointed a knife toward a steel refrigerator. "Cold water's in there. You'll want it later." It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. Naomi nodded and thanked her. "Don't get used to it," Rose added quickly. "Vivian doesn't like when we talk to new hires. She says it distracts them from knowing their place." Naomi opened the fridge and pulled out a bottle. She drank slowly, the water cooling her throat even as heat still pulsed in her cheeks. "I've worked for a lot of people," she said finally, "but never someone who seemed to enjoy testing people like that." Rose's knife paused for a beat. "She doesn't test. She breaks. That's the whole point." Naomi set the bottle back, her hand steady, despite the weight of Rose's words. "I'm not here to break," she said quietly. Rose let out a single humorless laugh. Neither were the last 9. The silence after that was thick. Naomi knew she wasn't going to win anyone over today, maybe not ever. But she wasn't here to make friends. She was here for Amara. By noon, Eleanor found her and gave her a list of tasks scribbled onto expensive stationery, dusting every surface in the formal sitting room, wiping the stairwell banister, washing and pressing the guest linens, even though no guests were expected that week. Naomi tackled the list without pause, moving room to room like a quiet shadow. She worked in silence, her back straight, her motions precise. No music, no phone, no distractions, just her and the work. Upstairs, she passed a long gallery of oil portraits, Langford's past and present. Naomi paused at one in particular. It featured a younger Charles Langford in a tuxedo, flanked by an older woman with diamond earrings and a frozen smile. She wondered what they'd think of the house now, of what it had become. Down the hall, she entered a linen room and began folding fresh sheets, smoothing them corner to corner. As she reached for a fitted sheet, the door creaked behind her. "Eleanor, you didn't finish the guest towels yet." "I was working down the list," Naomi said gently, careful not to sound defensive. Eleanor raised one thin brow. "Order matters in this house. Start with what you're told first, not what's convenient for you." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor lingered, her gaze hard. Then more softly than Naomi expected, she added, "Don't take anything personally. Vivian, she's complicated." Naomi said nothing. "I've worked here 23 years, Eleanor continued. "She's not the first mistress of this house, but she's the first to make this many people quit." "I won't be one of them," Naomi said simply. They held each other's gaze for a second longer than necessary, then Eleanor turned and walked away. By late afternoon, Naomi had scrubbed 3 staircases, vacuumed 2 rugs, and repolished a chandelier that had already gleamed like starlight. Her muscles ached, but she didn't complain. When dinner hour approached, she was called into the staff hall for a brief meal. Dennis sat at the end of the long table, reading the LA Times, not speaking. Rose served stew, but offered no eye contact. Eleanor sat silently sipping tea. Naomi took her seat, murmured a soft thank you, and ate in silence. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was waiting, watching. She knew they were measuring her not just for how she cleaned or spoke, but how she held herself when things got hard. After dinner, Naomi was shown to her room. It wasn't much a converted storage space with yellowing walls, a creaky twin bed, and one window that didn't quite shut all the way. But it was hers. She sat on the bed and opened her canvas bag. Inside, she pulled out the photograph of Amara. She ran her fingers gently over the image. Her daughter's eyes, big brown, full of something innocent and fierce, looked back at her. Naomi closed her eyes. 3 months. That was the promise, the contract, the hope. She lay back on the mattress which groaned beneath her. The ceiling was bare. The house above her still buzzed faintly voices, footsteps, distant classical music. She whispered again this time, so softly it barely counted as sound. 3 months. And in the quiet of that cold, strange room, Naomi Brooks let herself believe for just one breath that she could do it. By sunrise, the silent war had begun. Naomi rose before the sun reached over the hills of Bel Air. The air was still thick with a kind of hush that made the walls of the Langford estate feel even taller, even colder. She dressed quickly in the stiff gray uniform assigned to her, buttoned all the way to her throat hem just past her knees. No jewelry, no perfume, just silence and fabric. In the kitchen, the only sound was the steady chopping of Rose's knife. The cook didn't look up when Naomi entered, but she did nod toward the silver tray sitting on the counter. "Vivian wants her lemon water, 3 slices room temp, no seeds," she said as if reciting sacred instructions. Naomi washed her hands thoroughly, then reached for the lemons. She selected 3 of the brightest, juiciest ones in the bowl. Using a small paring knife, she sliced them with care, each piece even and clean. The water sat in a crystal carafe exactly 70 degrees. She strained it into a tall glass and fished out every seed with the tip of a spoon. She placed the glass on the tray. No trembling hands. No rush, just quiet focus. Rose raised an eyebrow. "We'll see," she muttered. Naomi carried the tray through the wide hallway, her shoes making no sound against the polished floor. The second-floor corridor was still dim, the heavy curtains drawn. She stopped in front of Vivian's bedroom door, inhaled once, then knocked softly. "Come," came the voice from within. Vivian sat at her vanity dressed in a robe of seafoam silk. Her hair was pinned up her eyes, scanning her reflection, as if she were searching for something to criticize. Naomi approached and set the tray gently on the side table. Vivian lifted the glass, took a sip, and immediately curled her lips in distaste. "Too cold," she said, her voice edged with that sugar-slick venom. "Didn't I make myself clear, or is your memory just as poor as your training? I'm very sorry, ma'am. I'll remake it right away." She turned to reach for the tray, but Vivian moved faster. With a flick of her wrist, she knocked the glass from the table. It hit the floor with a shatter water and lemons scattering across the marble. "Clean it up," Vivian said, not looking at her. "I don't want to step in your incompetence." Naomi knelt again, her knees meeting the cold floor with a quiet thud. Glass slivers sparkled under the light. She picked them up one by one, her fingers steady, even as the icy water soaked through the knees of her uniform. In her mind, she held the image of Amara's smile fragile and bright beneath hospital monitors. She didn't speak, didn't protest. Vivian finally turned in her chair, watching her with a narrowed gaze. "You're not going to cry?" she asked. "No, ma'am." Naomi stood once the floor was spotless. She nodded once, turned and left. By mid-morning, the tension in the house had thickened. Dennis glanced at her as she passed through the foyer, his expression less skeptical, now more interested, maybe even curious. In the laundry room, Eleanor appeared with a folded uniform in her arms. "Change into this," she said briskly. Naomi accepted the uniform without question, but when she opened the garment, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a uniform. It was a silk nightgown, sheer delicate and utterly inappropriate. Eleanor didn't meet her eyes. "It was hanging in your wardrobe. Not my decision." Naomi folded the nightgown back up and nodded. "Thank you," she said, as if nothing were unusual. In her room, she opened her canvas bag and pulled out the clothes she'd worn before arriving. Worn jeans, a soft gray t-shirt, clean but faded. She dressed quickly and headed back to the main house. The staff noticed immediately. Eyes followed her through the halls. Whispers curled at the edges of conversations. But Naomi kept her head high. In the dining room, Vivian waited dressed in an emerald green gown, her hair gleaming in the late morning light. When she saw Naomi, her smile spread wide. "What is this?" she asked, her voice falsely bright. "I thought we provided uniforms." "My uniform was missing, ma'am," Naomi said calmly, "so I wore my own clothes." Vivian walked slowly around her as if examining a stain on fine fabric. "Or perhaps you just feel more comfortable in rags. People like you tend to be used to this kind of look, don't they?" The air in the room stilled. Dennis stood rigid by the window. Rose paused mid-step with a tray. Eleanor watched from the doorway. Naomi didn't flinch. Vivian's voice rose slicing through the quiet. "Look at her. This is why I keep losing staff. Dirty, uneducated, bringing nothing into my home but filth and excuses. And yet they act like they deserve respect. Like they're owed something just because—" She stopped just short of saying it. But the meaning was loud enough. Naomi felt the sting in her chest, but she didn't show it. She looked at a point just beyond Vivian's shoulder and kept her voice low and even. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll do better." The words dropped into the room like stones. Vivian blinked. Just once. She hadn't expected that. Not again. She turned sharply and stormed out of the room, her heels clacking like gunfire against the tile. Naomi remained still for a moment. Then she bent and picked up the silver tray that Vivian had pushed aside. She took it back to the kitchen, washed it, dried it, and put it back in place. Rose stood near the stove, arms folded. "You know," she said, "most people cry by now." Naomi didn't answer. "Whatever it is you're holding inside," Rose continued, "you better make sure it's strong enough." Naomi looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly, but she still wasn't crying. Later that afternoon, as she was wiping down the grand piano in the music room, Eleanor approached again. This time without words. She placed a new correct uniform on the bench and walked away. A gesture, not an apology. Naomi took it, folded it neatly, and placed it over her arm. She didn't need a thank you. She just needed the job. That night, back in her room, she opened her wallet and looked at the photo of Amara again. 3 months. It was only day 2, and already the house had drawn blood from her pride, but she was still standing, still fighting, and in the stillness of the Langford estate where no one thought a maid like her could survive. Naomi whispered again more firmly this time, "I will not lose this job." Vivian had warned her. "I've only just begun." And she meant it. Naomi awoke on Thursday to the same pale morning light filtering through her window, but something in the air felt sharper, more loaded. She dressed in her uniform, tied her hair back neatly, and stepped into the hallway just as the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 6. The staff was already stirring. Eleanor moved like a shadow through the hallways, checking silver trays and dustless corners. Rose hummed lowly in the kitchen, stirring something fragrant. Dennis stood in the driveway, wiping down the Langford's Bentley, as though prepping it for war. But it was Vivian who set the tone for the day. Naomi entered the dining room carrying a tray of fresh fruit, just as Vivian walked in, already dressed for the morning, in a sleeveless ivory blouse and tailored cream pants. She held herself like she ruled the world, and maybe inside this house she did. Without warning, Vivian reached for a glass of red wine on the table, though it was barely past 9 a.m., and accidentally tipped it, letting the crimson liquid splash across the white Persian rug. "Oh, for God's sake!" she snapped, spinning toward Naomi. "Why would you put it there? Who taught you to set a tray like that?" The glass hadn't been near Naomi. She knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. Dennis stiffened in the doorway. Rose looked up from the kitchen pass-through. Eleanor paused her note-taking from behind a pillar. Naomi didn't defend herself. She grabbed a cloth, knelt beside the rug, and began blotting. The wine was already seeping into the fibers. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll be more careful next time." Vivian stared down at her. She was waiting for a protest, a crack, a twitch of anger. None came. She let out a soft scoff and walked away. Later that day, Naomi was dusting the sitting room when Vivian entered again, this time holding a tall antique vase, blue and white porcelain with gold leaf details. Naomi had seen it before in the catalog Eleanor kept for inventory. The vase was worth nearly $15,000. Vivian walked slowly, cradling the piece like a child. Naomi turned just in time to see it slip from her hands. It shattered against the marble floor, with a sound like ice breaking underfoot. Naomi didn't even blink. Vivian gasped loud and dramatic, as though she hadn't just watched it fall from her own hands. "What did you do?" she shrieked. "I didn't touch it, ma'am," Naomi said softly. "Oh, now you're calling me a liar." Vivian's voice sharpened. "This was an heirloom, a Langford family piece. You should be fired for this. I should have you arrested." Silence fell over the house. Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her mouth slightly open. Rose emerged behind her holding a dish rag. Dennis stepped in from outside, sunglasses still on. No one said a word. Naomi bent slowly, her knees pressing into the hard floor. She began gathering the porcelain shards with her bare hands. A few pieces pricked her fingers, drawing thin red lines. Still, she said nothing. Vivian's heels clicked as she stepped closer. "Do you know what that vase meant?" she whispered. "Of course you don't. You have no idea what real value is, no idea what it means to belong in a place like this." Naomi placed the last piece in her cloth and folded it shut. "I apologize for my carelessness, ma'am." Vivian stared at her for a long moment, searching for something. Rage, tears, fear. She found none, and that was what shook her most. She turned on her heel and walked out. From across the room in the archway leading toward his study, Charles Langford had been watching the entire time. He hadn't meant to be there. He'd come home early from a meeting downtown. But as he entered the hallway and heard Vivian's voice, sharp biting, he paused. He had stood in the shadows and seen it all. The vase, the fall, the accusation, and Naomi's silence. That night, Charles didn't go straight to bed. Instead, he sat in his leather chair, whiskey in hand, staring out the window. The house was quiet now, but the image of Naomi kneeling on the floor, fingers bleeding as she cleaned up what wasn't her fault, lingered like smoke. She hadn't argued, hadn't cried. She'd just absorbed it, like a wall absorbing rain. Charles had always known Vivian could be exacting. But this was something else. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Naomi carried herself. Not meek, not proud, just strong. It disturbed him more than he cared to admit. The next morning he passed Naomi in the hallway. She bowed her head slightly. "Good morning, sir." Charles paused. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone formal but thoughtful. "How are you finding the house?" Naomi blinked, surprised. He had never addressed her directly before. "It's a learning experience, sir," she replied. He nodded slow. "Let Eleanor know if you need anything." She nodded back. "Thank you." Later that day, Charles approached Vivian in the library. "She's different," he said. Vivian didn't look up from her tablet. "She's temporary, like the rest. She doesn't act like it." Vivian's lips twitched. "Give her time." Charles studied his wife for a long moment. "Maybe you should give her a chance." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "People like her only behave when you keep them on a short leash. You let up, they get lazy. Entitled. People like her." Charles repeated, his voice cooling. "I meant—" "The staff," Vivian said quickly. He didn't reply. He just walked away, the words lingering between them like poison in the air. In the days that followed, Naomi noticed a change. It wasn't that things got easier. Vivian was still cruel, still sharp. But the others, Rose, Dennis, even Eleanor, watched her differently. Less like someone waiting to break, more like someone they quietly respected. In the upstairs hallway one afternoon, Eleanor passed her with a fresh towel in hand. "You held your ground," she murmured, just loud enough for Naomi to hear. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. Each day in the Langford house was a test. And though the tests never stopped, Naomi had begun to pass them, not with fire, not with fight, but with the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who had already lived through worse, someone who had something to protect far beyond herself, someone who was no longer just surviving. She was starting to be seen. Vivian's anger had changed lately. It was no longer explosive. It had become something more dangerous, calculated. A quiet hostility that simmered beneath every word, every look like a gas leak waiting for the right spark. Naomi sensed it the moment she stepped into the master bedroom with the silver tray. Vivian stood at her vanity applying perfume. The room was filled with the scent of jasmine and crushed citrus, but it did nothing to soften the tension in the air. Naomi set the tray down carefully, lemon water just as instructed. Room temperature, 3 slices, no seeds. Vivian didn't look at it. She didn't look at Naomi either. Instead, she reached for a baccarat crystal perfume bottle, one of the expensive ones Charles had gifted her on their first anniversary. It sat like a crown jewel on the mirrored vanity. Naomi had dusted it the day before, carefully lifting it by the base with a linen cloth. As Naomi turned to leave, she heard the bottle tip. She turned back instinctively and caught it just before it hit the floor. Her hands trembled as she set it upright, heart pounding. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, breathless. "I'll be more careful." Vivian turned. Her eyes were sharp. Not surprised, not startled, just cold. Without a word, she raised her hand and struck Naomi across the face. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Naomi's head snapped to the side. Her cheek stung. A breath caught in her throat. She did not speak. She did not move. Vivian leaned in her voice a hiss. "Careful isn't good enough. You'll never own anything like this in your lifetime, Naomi. You don't belong in this house. Don't pretend like you do." Naomi slowly turned back to the tray, fingers shaking. "I understand, ma'am," she said, voice low. "I'll do better." From the hallway, Charles Langford stood frozen. He hadn't meant to be there. He'd come upstairs early from his study, planning to grab a file from his bedroom. But as he reached the top landing, he'd heard Vivian's voice, then the slap, then silence. He stepped forward instinctively, just in time to see Naomi bow her head and turn away her cheek already red with the mark of Vivian's hand. Vivian turned and stopped short when she saw him. Their eyes locked. She straightened, smoothing her blouse as if the slap had never happened. "James," she said, using the name she reserved for public composure. "I didn't know you were home." "What happened?" Charles asked quietly. Vivian's eyes shifted. "Nothing. Just the maid's carelessness." Naomi didn't look up. She was already backing out of the room, carrying the tray as if it were her shield. Charles glanced at her retreating figure, then back at Vivian. "You don't have to be so harsh," he said. Vivian blinked visibly, caught off guard. "You don't understand," she replied quickly. "People like her only work well under pressure. If you let them get too comfortable, they make mistakes. They get sloppy." Charles's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "People like her," he repeated. His voice was low, steady, but razor-sharp. Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I meant the staff." Charles didn't say anything else. He turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkened library, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, staring at the fire that had long since gone cold. He couldn't get the image out of his mind, Naomi standing there absorbing that slap without a sound, not in fear, not in defeat, but in something else entirely, something he didn't understand. Strength, maybe, or something deeper, something born of necessity of a world he'd never had to live in. Vivian came into the room just before midnight, her silk robe whispering against the carpet. "You're still awake," she said. Charles didn't look at her. "You hit her." Vivian stopped. He turned toward her slowly. "You hit her, and then you lied to me about it." Vivian folded her arms, defensive. She nearly dropped the perfume bottle. It could have shattered all over the floor. That crystal cost more than she makes in a year. So that makes it okay to strike her. Vivian's mouth tightened. "Don't start lecturing me about discipline. You don't know what it takes to manage staff, especially people who come from nothing." Charles stood up, his voice low and dangerous now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She just took it. "Exactly," Vivian snapped. "She knows her place." "No," Charles said. "She knows survival." That silenced her. He stepped closer, eyes steady. "And that's the difference between you and her. You pretend strength. She lives it." Vivian flinched barely, but he saw it. Without another word, he left the room. Downstairs, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, her palm pressed gently against her cheek. It still throbbed. She hadn't cried. She wasn't going to. She reached for the little photo frame on her bedside table, the one with Eden smiling wide, her front tooth missing her braids tied with blue ribbons. Naomi closed her eyes. "Just a little longer," she whispered. "I'm almost there." And upstairs, Charles sat alone in the darkness of his bedroom, watching the door his wife had closed behind her. He had never questioned the truth of this house, not until now. Charles Langford began watching his house more carefully, not with suspicion, but with a quiet unease that refused to leave him. He told himself it was nothing at first, that the slap was an isolated event, that maybe Vivian had simply lost her temper. But Naomi's silence, that unwavering calm, stayed with him, and it began to change how he saw everything. He started noticing the small things, how Naomi's eyes never quite met anyone's, how the staff stiffened when Vivian entered a room, how conversations died when he passed by unexpectedly. One evening, while he was reviewing contracts in the upstairs study, Charles heard a commotion from the dining room. Glass shattering, a sharp intake of breath, then silence. He stood quickly and moved down the hallway. From the open doorway he saw it all. A large crimson stain spread across the white Persian rug. A wineglass lay shattered. Naomi knelt beside it, blotting at the mess with shaking hands. Vivian stood at the head of the table, arms crossed her face, a mask of annoyance. "Why would you place the glass right at the edge like that?" she snapped. "Are you trying to ruin everything in this house?" Naomi didn't speak. She continued blotting the wine, slow and methodical. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quietly. "It won't happen again." Vivian turned her eyes, flicking toward Charles in the hallway. She faltered. He didn't say anything. Not yet, just watched. Later that night, as Vivian prepared for bed, Charles leaned against the doorway of their shared bedroom. "You knocked over that wine glass on purpose," he said. Vivian didn't look up from her moisturizer. "Don't be ridiculous." He said nothing more. But the next morning, he asked the housekeeper to bring Naomi's schedule to his study. He started paying attention. 3 days later, he watched from the top of the stairs as Naomi carried a tray of dishes through the hallway. Vivian passed her holding a delicate glass vase, an antique from Vienna, rare and irreplaceable. Just as they crossed paths, Vivian stumbled. The vase slipped. It shattered against the marble floor. Vivian gasped, then turned sharply toward Naomi. "Are you blind?" she cried. "You nearly ran into me. Do you know what you've just destroyed?" Naomi stood still. Her face was unreadable. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "You're sorry," Vivian repeated, her voice rising. "Do you know how hard it is to find a piece like that? And this is the second time this week?" Naomi bent slowly, picking up the shards with bare hands. "Be careful," Charles said from the staircase. Both women looked up. Vivian's expression hardened. Naomi didn't pause. She simply kept gathering the broken glass. Vivian turned to Charles. Her voice clipped. "It's fine. I'll replace it." He didn't respond. But that night he couldn't sleep. The patterns were becoming clear. Every time Naomi did something right, something just happened to go wrong around her. And every time it did, Vivian was there, never shocked, never surprised, always just irritated enough to punish. He remembered what Naomi had said after the slap. "I understand, ma'am. I'll do better." It hadn't been weakness. It had been survival. A silent armor. Charles began watching more, from behind bookshelves, from around corners, from the balcony overlooking the dining room. What he saw disturbed him. The staff had changed. They spoke less, moved quietly, avoided eye contact. Naomi most of all seemed to drift through the house like a ghost, unseen, unacknowledged, but doing everything exactly right. Never late, never sloppy, never a word out of place. Yet the accidents continued. A plate missing from a set. A lamp flickering in a hallway where Naomi had just passed. A torn cushion on a chair she'd vacuumed. Each time Vivian blamed her. Each time Naomi took it. Charles began to question himself. How had he missed this for so long? What else had he allowed to happen under this roof while he focused on boardrooms and profit margins? One night after the house had gone quiet, he walked the halls in silence. He passed Naomi's room and paused. Her door was cracked open. Inside, she sat on her small bed knees, drawn up, holding something in her hands. A photo. Charles recognized the child in it, the little girl from Naomi's paperwork. Eden, her daughter. He watched as Naomi traced her fingers over the image, then tucked it beneath her pillow. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but the pain on her face was unmistakable. Charles stepped back into the shadows, a knot forming in his chest. The next day, he sat in his study, staring at the antique clock on the wall. Vivian walked in without knocking. "You're avoiding me," she said. "I've been busy." With what thinking? She arched an eyebrow. About what Charles met her gaze, about what's happening in this house, about you, about Naomi. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You're letting her manipulate you. That girl's smarter than you think. She plays the victim well. She hasn't said a word." "Exactly," Vivian said, crossing her arms. "She wants your pity. She wants to look noble. She wants to survive." Vivian scoffed. "She's a maid." "She's a mother," Charles said quietly. "And I've been watching her. You've been targeting her. I know it." Vivian's face darkened. "So now you're taking her side? I'm taking the truth's side." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Vivian laughed bitterly. "She'll never last. They never do. No one belongs here except people like us." Charles stared at her, and for the first time he wondered whether Vivian truly believed that, or whether she was clinging to a lie she had told herself for so long that it had become her only reality. He said nothing. But the next morning, he instructed the head housekeeper to reroute all complaints to him directly, and he made sure Naomi knew it. The days had grown quieter inside the Langford estate, but it wasn't peace. It was tension low and humming beneath every polished surface, every passing glance, every unspoken word. Naomi felt it with every breath she took. The silence was no longer just a condition of her job. It was a shield, something she wrapped around herself like a threadbare coat, too thin to keep the cold out, but still better than nothing. Vivian hadn't spoken to her in days, but her absence wasn't mercy. It was warning. Charles had been around more often. Naomi noticed. She never said anything, never changed her behavior, but she saw how he started asking the staff questions, how he paused longer in rooms she was cleaning, how his eyes lingered when she passed in silence. She didn't understand why, but she was too tired to wonder. That Friday morning began like any other. Naomi had risen before dawn, her bones aching in the quiet, her hands already sore from the day before. She made the beds, ironed shirts, washed dishes no one had used. Everything had to gleam. Vivian hadn't made a sound all day. Until just after noon. Naomi had been dusting the bookshelves in the formal study when Vivian entered like a storm in silk heels. She didn't speak at first. She stood by the door watching. Naomi straightened, lowering the cloth in her hand. "Ma'am," she said softly. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "That vase on the hallway table," she said coldly. "It's gone." Naomi blinked. "I moved it, ma'am. It was near the edge. I didn't want it to fall. And who told you to touch it?" "No one," Naomi replied, voice even. "I was trying to protect it." Vivian stepped closer, her heels sharp against the wood. "You don't decide what stays or goes in this house," she said, her voice rising. "You're here to follow instructions, not make decisions." Naomi didn't flinch. "I'm sorry," she said. But Vivian wasn't looking for an apology. She was looking for a reaction. And when Naomi's face remained still calm, unmoved, something in Vivian cracked. Her hand came up, fast. It struck Naomi hard across the face, the sound loud in the echoing study. Naomi stumbled backward, catching herself on the edge of the bookshelf. She didn't cry out. She touched her cheek fingers, brushing the red mark blooming across her skin. Vivian stood over her breath, shallow fists clenched. Then Vivian. Charles's voice. It came from the doorway, low, sharp, deadly still. Both women turned. He was standing there, frozen mid-step, his eyes locked on the red mark across Naomi's cheek. His face was pale with fury. Vivian's mouth opened-closed. "I leave," Charles said. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade. Vivian stared at him. "Charles, you don't understand. I said leave." Silence fell. Vivian faltered. For a moment, Naomi thought she might fight it, might scream or cry or defend herself. But instead, Vivian turned on her heel and walked out, the echo of her heels, sharp and fast like retreating gunfire. Charles didn't move. He didn't look at the door. His eyes were on Naomi, on the hand still pressed lightly to her cheek, and then he crossed the room. She didn't back away, but she did lower her gaze. "I'm sorry," she said. The words felt ridiculous the moment they left her mouth. He shook his head slowly. "You don't apologize," he said quietly. "Not for this." He reached out, then paused. His hand hovered in the space between them, hesitant, unsure. Naomi didn't speak, didn't move, so Charles closed the distance. His fingers touched the side of her face gently, reverently, as if afraid she might break beneath his hand. Naomi's breath caught. It wasn't the pain. It was the touch itself, so careful, so unearned, and yet it made her feel something she hadn't felt in months. Seen. His thumb brushed the edge of the bruise. "I should have stopped this sooner," he said. "I knew it was happening. I watched it happen." Naomi opened her mouth, but nothing came. What could she say? That it wasn't his fault, that she was used to it, that this violence, this dismissal, had followed her for as long as she could remember. His hand dropped slowly. She missed it the moment it was gone. "Come with me," Charles said. She blinked. "Sir, I want the house doctor to look at you." "That's not necessary." "It is." Naomi hesitated, but he was already walking toward the door. He didn't look back, and for reasons she didn't understand, Naomi followed. There are stories that don't shout for attention, yet they linger in the corners of your mind long after the final page turns. This was one of them, a quiet triumph born in a house that once echoed with coldness, now softened by understanding. It began as a cruel imbalance of power, a place where prejudice seemed to stand unshakable. But by the end, what endured was not the wealth or the marble floors, but the quiet courage of one woman who refused to let bitterness define her. The lesson is as old as it is vital. Dignity is not a gift others grant us. It is something we carry even when the world tries to strip it away. True justice doesn't always arrive with noise and thunder. Sometimes it comes through steady hands, calm words, and a heart that refuses to harden. In every neighborhood, in every Black community, there are people who fight battles unseen, showing that perseverance and grace can be more powerful than rage. We may think we know the measure of a person from the outside, but life has a way of humbling that certainty. In truth, as this story reminds us, Black community strength often blooms in the very soil that others try to dismiss. Like a lamp burning quietly in a window through a storm, a single act of compassion can guide us through life's darkest hallways. That act may come from where we least expect it, yes, even from someone we once feared or resented. And in that meeting point between pain and kindness, there's a chance for something rare, the healing of two hearts, and the rippling change that can touch an entire Black community. So take a moment to reflect on the journey we've shared here. Think about the people in your own life who've been misjudged, underestimated, or quietly carrying more than they let on. If this story has found its way into your heart, consider letting its warmth pass through you to someone else who needs it. You never know whose life might be changed by a kindness you choose to give today.